I used to believe that love and trust were enough, that if two people promised to build a future together, they'd actually do it. For 22 years, that's exactly what I thought my husband and I were doing. We kept our expenses low, skipped vacations, and said no to dinners out. We're saving for retirement, he'd always say, with that reassuring smile I once believed meant safety. And I believed him. Every cent I earned as a teacher, I placed into our shared account. Every financial decision, I deferred to him, because that's what you do when you trust someone completely. I was proud of us, proud that one day we'd enjoy quiet mornings by the lake, travel the world, and live the life we'd built side by side. But that dream shattered the day I opened a credit card bill addressed to a name I didn't recognize. It was my husband's account, but the charges weren't for groceries or investments. They were for luxury handbags, hotel suites, and jewelry I'd never seen. And that retirement account we'd been building, it was funding someone else's lifestyle. I wish I could tell you I walked away right then, but betrayal has a strange way of paralyzing you, making you question everything you thought you knew. And what I discovered after that day went far beyond infidelity. It was a story of manipulation, lies, and a betrayal so deep it nearly destroyed me until I decided to destroy him instead. Stay with me until the end, because the revenge I planned wasn't just poetic. It was legal, devastating, and worth every single tear I cried. Chapter 1: The Future We Never Built. I met Daniel when I was 32, freshly divorced, and determined never to lose myself in someone again. He was gentle, attentive, and endlessly reassuring, the kind of man who opened doors, remembered how I liked my coffee, and spoke about the future as if it were a shared promise rather than a distant dream. "We'll grow old together," he used to say, "and when we do, we'll look back and know that every sacrifice was worth it." At first, I believed him. And honestly, for a long time, he gave me every reason to. We were that couple who set goals together, the kind who read books about financial planning and made spreadsheets for retirement. Every decision, from where we lived to how often we traveled, was filtered through the same phrase: we're saving for the future. It became a mantra, a shield, and a justification all at once. When friends took vacations to Italy, we stayed home. When colleagues upgraded their cars, we kept the old sedan. Daniel said every dollar we saved was another day of peace when we were old, and I wanted that peace more than anything. I didn't notice how quickly we became him. It started with small things, decisions made without me, documents I wasn't asked to sign, accounts I wasn't allowed to check, because it was easier if one of us handled it. I never saw it as a red flag. I saw it as trust. After all, wasn't this what partners did? They shared the load. They believed in each other. And I believed in him so deeply that I didn't question a single thing. There were signs, of course. There always are. A sudden insistence that I stop working extra hours because we don't need the money. Strange purchases explained away as investments or business expenses. A new phone he never let out of his sight. But I told myself stories to explain it all because the alternative was too painful to imagine. If I had to choose between suspicion and comfort, I chose comfort. I chose to believe that my husband was the man I married, not the one I feared he might become. The first crack in the illusion came during a conversation about our retirement plans. We were sitting on the porch on a warm Sunday evening, sipping wine and watching the sun set over the street. I asked how much we'd managed to save after all these years. It was a casual question, the kind a wife asks without hesitation. But Daniel hesitated. He looked down at his glass, swirled it once, and gave me a vague answer, too vague for a man who prided himself on knowing numbers down to the cent. Something shifted inside me then. It was small, like the first tremor before an earthquake, but it was enough to keep me awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering why a man so meticulous suddenly seemed so unsure. And that was the first time I realized maybe our future wasn't being built for both of us. Maybe it was being built for someone else. Chapter 2: Little Lies, Big Secrets. The first real sign that something was wrong came wrapped in something so ordinary, so trivial, that I almost ignored it. A receipt. It was buried in the pocket of Daniel's jeans. A crumpled slip from a boutique I'd never heard of, a place that sold women's designer shoes. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe it was a gift for me. Maybe he was planning a surprise. Maybe he picked it up by mistake. But as I stood there in the laundry room, holding that piece of paper in my hand, a quiet, cold thought crept in. Since when does my husband buy $1,000 shoes? When I asked him about it later, he didn't even blink. Oh, that, he said casually. It was for a client's wife. A retirement gift. Networking stuff. I nodded, even smiled, but something in his tone unsettled me. He was too relaxed, too rehearsed. And what kind of client's wife gets designer shoes from my husband, the man who insisted we couldn't afford a vacation for 5 years? After that day, I started noticing more little things. Restaurant charges for two, jewelry purchases from stores we'd never shopped at, hotel bookings under his name in cities he claimed he'd never visited. When I confronted him, he always had an explanation ready, smooth, believable, perfectly crafted. Business dinner, corporate retreat, a raffle prize for a company event. And I wanted so badly to believe him that I let each lie pass with a nervous laugh and a quick change of subject. But they piled up, and with each new explanation, the foundation of trust I'd built my life on cracked a little more. Then came the credit card bill, the one addressed to a P.O. box I didn't know existed. I found it accidentally stuffed between utility statements in the kitchen drawer. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. There were transactions from high-end restaurants, luxury spas, boutique hotels, and even a private wine club membership. None of them were mine. None of them had anything to do with us. I sat at the kitchen table for hours that night, staring at those charges, and a memory from a decade earlier floated back. It was the day we opened our first joint savings account. I'd been so proud, so hopeful. This is our future, Daniel had said, slipping the paperwork across the desk with a smile. We're going to build something solid. And now, staring at the evidence in my lap, I realized he had been building something, just not with me. Still, I wasn't ready to confront him. I needed more than receipts and suspicions. I needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I started watching him. I checked our accounts daily. I memorized his schedule. I paid attention to the way he dressed when he said he was going to meet a client. And slowly patterns emerged. Meetings that ended later and later. Phone calls he took outside, in hushed tones. Trips he claimed were mandatory, but never appeared on any itinerary. One evening, he came home unusually late, past midnight. His hair was perfectly styled, his shirt freshly pressed. He looked happy, radiant even. Rough day? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Just work, he said with a grin I hadn't seen in years. Then he kissed my cheek and went to shower. I sat on the edge of our bed and stared at the man I built my life with, realizing that I didn't recognize him anymore. The breaking point came a week later. I was sorting through our mail when I noticed a sleek, black envelope addressed to Daniel. Curious and admittedly suspicious, I opened it. Inside was an invitation to a private gala hosted by an exclusive art foundation. The invitation was for Daniel and guest, and handwritten in gold ink beneath the printed text was a note, "Can't wait to show you off again." See, that's when the puzzle pieces clicked together. The mysterious purchases, the business trips, the credit card bills, and the P.O. box. C wasn't a client. She wasn't a colleague. She was the reason our savings were disappearing. She was the woman my husband was building a future with, while I sat at home, believing we were building one together. I wish I could tell you I stormed into his office and confronted him right then. I didn't. I wish I could say I packed my bags and left. I didn't do that either. Instead, I did what I do best. I planned. I studied. I gathered every scrap of evidence I could find: bank statements, hotel reservations, receipts, emails. Because if Daniel thought he could spend our future on someone else, he was about to learn that I was done playing the trusting wife. By the time he came home that night, humming softly and kissing me on the forehead, I had already decided I would not cry. I would not beg. I would not warn him. I would take everything he had built, and I would make sure that the next time he looked at me, he'd understand what betrayal really costs. Chapter 3. The Other Woman. The moment I read the name C, scribbled in gold ink, something inside me shifted from suspicion to certainty. It was no longer a matter of if. Now it was about who. Who was she? How long had she been in our lives? How many lies had he told to keep her hidden in the shadows, while I played the devoted wife in the light? That night, as Daniel slept beside me, the same man who had sworn that every sacrifice we made was for our future, I stared at the ceiling and silently promised myself one thing. I was going to find her. And when I did, I'd make them both regret ever thinking I was blind. The first step was simple: information. Daniel had always been meticulous with his privacy, but he'd grown careless. That black envelope, the boutique receipts, the travel itineraries, they were all breadcrumbs, and I was done ignoring them. I started by combing through our shared bank accounts. At first, nothing seemed out of place until I noticed a series of regular transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Small amounts at first, just a few $100s here and there. But over the years, those harmless transactions had grown into thousands, tens of thousands. Money that was supposed to fund our retirement was instead paying for someone else's rent, her vacations, her life. Then I checked the phone bill. Daniel always claimed he needed 2 phones, one for work, one for personal use, but I noticed a number that appeared far too often, sometimes dozens of times a day. It didn't belong to a client or a colleague. It was her. And every time that number appeared, my chest tightened a little more. I could have called her right then. I could have screamed, cursed, exposed everything. But rage wasn't what I wanted. Not yet. I wanted knowledge. I wanted leverage. So I did something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. The man I found was discreet, experienced, and worth every cent. Within a week, he handed me a thin envelope with photographs and notes that made my hands shake. C was not just a random woman. She was 38, almost 15 years younger than me, and a marketing executive for a luxury brand. She lived in a penthouse apartment downtown, paid for by none other than Daniel. The business trips he'd taken, they were weekends in Paris, Milan, New York. The networking dinners, private anniversaries in restaurants I could never afford. And the jewelry, the handbags, the designer clothes, all of it, every last piece, was purchased with the money I had helped save. What cut the deepest wasn't the cheating itself. It was the depth of the lie. Daniel hadn't just betrayed me physically. He had built a second life with her, funded by my loyalty, my labor, my trust. And he had done it so effortlessly, so confidently, that I realized he had never once considered being caught. He believed I was too naive, too docile, too dependent to ever fight back. But that belief was about to become his downfall. One evening, while Daniel was working late, I decided to visit her apartment. I didn't go inside. I didn't even ring the bell. I just stood across the street and watched. I watched him arrive with flowers. I watched him hold her hand as they entered the building. And I watched as the man I thought I knew disappeared behind a door that had never been meant for me. It should have broken me, and for a moment, it did. Standing there in the cold, I felt like a stranger in my own story, the supporting character in a life I had helped write. But then something unexpected happened. The sadness hardened into resolve. The tears dried, and for the first time in months, I stopped asking why he did it and started planning what I was going to do next. I walked back to my car with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I knew who she was now. I knew where she lived, what she did, and how he paid for every piece of her life. And that knowledge gave me power, because betrayal only destroys you when you feel powerless. And I was done being powerless. From that night forward, every interaction with Daniel became a performance. I smiled at his jokes. I kissed him goodnight. I pretended to believe his excuses. All the while I was building a case, one bank statement, one email, one photograph at a time. Because when I finally confronted him, I wasn't going to cry or beg or scream. I was going to burn his perfect little secret life to the ground. And the first match had already been lit. Chapter 4, Building the Trap. There's a moment in every betrayal story when anger transforms into clarity, when the fog of humiliation lifts, and you start seeing not just what they did, but how you're going to make them pay. For me, that moment happened in the quiet of my kitchen, surrounded by piles of bank statements, printed emails, and photographs from the private investigator. It was all there. The lies, the spending, the second life Daniel had built on the foundation of my trust. And instead of crying, I smiled, because I finally realized that I wasn't powerless. I was armed. The first step in my plan wasn't confrontation. It was control. Daniel had always prided himself on handling the finances, but that also meant he had left a trail of overconfidence behind. I began by meeting with a lawyer, someone who specialized in divorce cases involving hidden assets. I told her everything, every suspicious transfer, every fake business trip, every purchase. She listened quietly, then smiled in a way that made my spine tingle. "You have more leverage than you think," she said. "If you play this right, he'll lose everything he's trying to protect." We started with the basics. I opened new bank accounts in my name only. I rerouted my salary and savings. Then I quietly removed myself from any joint obligations I could, utility bills, automatic payments, even shared credit cards. It took weeks, but by the end of it, I was financially independent for the first time in years. Daniel didn't notice a thing. Why would he? He was too busy playing the perfect boyfriend to his younger mistress, too wrapped up in the illusion that his double life was invisible. Next came the deeper work, tracking and documenting. My lawyer taught me how to subpoena bank records, how to trace offshore accounts, how to request documentation without tipping him off. Every time Daniel lied about late meetings, I logged the date, time, and location. Every expensive charge. Every email that hinted at their relationship, every photo the investigator captured. I stored it all in a neatly organized folder labeled retirement plan. The irony wasn't lost on me, but financial revenge wasn't enough. I wanted something more permanent, something that would sting long after the lawyers were done. So I began preparing socially, too. Daniel had a reputation to protect. A respected consultant, a mentor to younger colleagues, a man admired in our community. But reputations are fragile and secrets are corrosive. I started attending events I used to skip, reconnecting with mutual friends, gently planting seeds about how busy he'd been lately, how strange some of his financial choices had become. I didn't accuse him outright. I didn't need to. People draw their own conclusions when you give them the pieces. One of the most satisfying steps was contacting the woman's company. She worked for a prestigious brand with strict codes of conduct. I sent an anonymous tip, Just a few documents showing that company funds had been misused for business trips that were anything but business. I didn't hear back, of course. But I noticed weeks later that she suddenly stopped appearing in the investigators' photos. My guess? Her glamorous career was no longer as secure as she thought. Through it all, Daniel remained blissfully ignorant. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still told me we were on track with our retirement savings, still believed I was the same trusting wife he had manipulated for years. I played my part perfectly. I made his meals, laughed at his jokes, and even suggested we plan a getaway. Just the two of us. I needed him relaxed, unsuspecting. The more confident he felt, the harder the fall would be. And fall he would, because once I had everything I needed, the evidence, the legal team, the financial independence, and the social groundwork, there would be no confrontation, no screaming match, no tears. There would only be consequences. I imagined the look on his face the day he'd come home to find the locks changed, the accounts frozen, and divorce papers waiting on the table. I pictured him calling C, only to find her number disconnected. I could almost hear the silence that would follow when he realized the empire he built on lies had collapsed beneath him. And the best part, he'd never see it coming, because revenge isn't loud. It's silent, patient, and calculated. And mine was just getting started. Chapter 5, Cracks in His Perfect World. It began with the smallest of inconveniences, things so subtle that Daniel dismissed them as bad luck. The first was a declined credit card at a restaurant. He laughed it off, blaming the bank, but I could see the faint crease of confusion in his forehead when the waiter brought the machine back a second time. The second was a letter from the mortgage company, politely informing him that his automatic payments had been reassigned due to a change in account ownership. That one he didn't laugh off. He read it twice, his brow furrowed, then folded it and tucked it into his briefcase without a word. I said nothing. Silence was part of the plan. The more he wondered, the more anxious he'd become. And the more anxious he became, the more mistakes he'd make. For weeks, I watched from the sidelines as his perfect little double life started to show hairline fractures. He missed a payment on one of his hidden accounts. He received a notice from the tax office about unreported income. One of his business partners, likely a shell company he used to funnel money to her, suddenly demanded documentation he couldn't provide. The man who had built an entire existence on control was slowly losing his grip, and he didn't even know why. Then, one evening, he came home later than usual. His hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, and for the first time in years, he looked genuinely tired. He sat down at the kitchen table, poured himself a drink, and stared into the glass. "Something's not right," he muttered, almost to himself. I feigned concern. "What do you mean?" He shook his head. "Some accounts are acting up. Payments aren't going through. And I can't get hold of my accountant. It's like things are slipping through my fingers." I wanted to laugh. God, I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I placed a hand on his arm and offered the most comforting smile I could muster. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said. "You always figure things out." That night, while he slept restlessly beside me, I opened my laptop and reviewed the progress of my plan. Everything was falling into place perfectly. The legal filings were ready. My financial independence was complete. And the final phase, the one that would devastate him beyond repair, was about to begin. The following week, I made my move. I filed for divorce. Quietly, discreetly, without drama. My lawyer arranged for the paperwork to be delivered to his office on a Friday afternoon, just before the weekend, when he'd have 2 long, sleepless nights to sit with the reality of what was coming. When the papers arrived, I was sitting at home, drinking tea by the window. My phone buzzed once, twice, then over a dozen times. At first, it was text messages. "We need to talk. Please answer." "What is this?" And then the calls started. I let every one of them go to voicemail. By the time he finally walked through the door, he looked like a ghost. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, waving the divorce papers in the air. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said calmly. "I'm done. Done." His voice cracked. "You're throwing away 20 years? Just like that?" I stood, walked toward him, and looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm not throwing anything away, Daniel. You did that. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every night you spent with her, you threw this away piece by piece. I'm just sweeping up what's left." For the first time since this all began, he had nothing to say. No excuses. No explanations. Just silence. Over the next few days, the situation worsened. His accounts, once overflowing, were locked under court order. His credit lines were suspended pending investigation. And because I had meticulously documented every transfer and every asset, the lawyers were confident I'd walk away with the majority of what we had built. I even received a call from someone I didn't expect. Her, the mistress. Her voice trembled on the line as she asked if I really had to do this. I almost laughed. "You were happy to spend my money," I told her. "Now you can help him figure out how to make more." Then I hung up. It was delicious, watching the empire he built on betrayal crumble beneath his feet. But more than that, it was liberating. For the first time in years, I was steering the ship. I wasn't the trusting, naive woman who believed in saving for retirement. I was the woman who turned betrayal into a weapon. And I wasn't finished yet. The final blow was still to come. And when it did, Daniel wouldn't just lose money. He'd lose everything. Chapter 6. Collapse. Daniel had always believed he was untouchable, that his charm, his reputation, and his carefully crafted double life would shield him from consequences. But by the time we reached this stage, the illusion he'd built was cracking in ways even he couldn't patch together. And the thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just destroy relationships. It dismantles identities. Piece by piece, it was happening to him. The first public blow came on a Tuesday morning. He was supposed to give a keynote speech at a corporate event, something he had boasted about for weeks. But halfway through his presentation, his phone began buzzing relentlessly. At first, he ignored it. Then his face changed, the way a man's does when he realizes a secret has just gone public. Someone, perhaps an anonymous source, had leaked photographs of him and her on a weekend trip to Paris. Photos of him holding hands, kissing her, checking into a hotel under a false name. They spread like wildfire to colleagues, clients, friends. By the time he walked off that stage, the respect he'd spent decades building was already in ashes. The second blow was financial. The court granted an emergency freeze on all shared assets pending the divorce investigation. Accounts he once controlled without question were now locked. Investments were placed under review. The penthouse he'd been paying for, repossessed. His credit score plummeting. His carefully curated image of the successful, stable husband was unraveling in front of everyone, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. At home, the tension was palpable. He no longer swaggered through the front door. He walked in with hunched shoulders, eyes hollow, his voice reduced to a whisper. "We can fix this," he said one night, his hands trembling as he reached for mine. "I made mistakes. I was stupid, but we can rebuild." I stared at him, a man I once believed I'd grow old with, and felt nothing. No rage, no heartbreak, just the cold, satisfying certainty that his suffering had only just begun. "You didn't make a mistake, Daniel," I said quietly. "You built an entire life on my back, and now you're going to watch it crumble." Then came the third blow, the one he hadn't anticipated. Remember that anonymous tip I'd sent to her company? It had snowballed. An internal investigation was launched. She was placed on leave. Within weeks, she was terminated for violating corporate ethics policies. Her glamorous career, the one Daniel had so proudly bankrolled, vanished overnight. She moved out of the penthouse, cut off contact, and disappeared from his life as swiftly as she had entered it. He spiraled after that. Sleepless nights, missed meetings, nervous breakdowns. Once, I caught him sitting in the dark living room at 3 a.m., staring blankly at the divorce papers spread across the coffee table. "How did it come to this?" he whispered. The answer was simple: greed, arrogance, betrayal. And yet, the most satisfying part wasn't watching his world collapse. It was watching myself rise from the wreckage. For so long, I'd been the woman in the background, the one who trusted, supported, and sacrificed. Now I was the architect of his downfall, and I felt no guilt about it. When our divorce hearing finally arrived, Daniel barely resembled the man I had married. His once expensive suits hung loosely on his frame. His confident voice was replaced by stammered apologies. He begged the judge for leniency, claimed he was manipulated and misunderstood. But the evidence spoke louder than his excuses. The court sided with me, awarding me the house, the savings, and a substantial portion of his future earnings. As we left the courtroom, he approached me one last time. "Please," he said, tears streaming down his face, "can we at least try to talk?" I looked at him for a long moment, not with hatred, but with a strange, peaceful detachment. "Talk," I said softly. "You spent years lying to me, Daniel. You had every chance to talk. And now, the only conversation left is between you and your regrets." I walked away without looking back. And for the first time in decades, the future felt like mine again. Not ours. Not his. Mine. Chapter 7. Life after him. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, in the stillness of mornings that were finally mine, in the silence of a home no longer filled with lies, in the weight that lifted off my chest every time I remembered that I no longer had to share my future with a man who had treated it like a game. The first few weeks after the divorce were strange. I'd been Daniel's wife for more than 2 decades, and even though my love for him had withered long before the papers were signed, my life had been built around him. The routines, the plans, the small compromises that seem harmless until you realize how much of yourself they've cost. All of it was gone. The house was mine now. The accounts were under my name, and the calendar was empty. I woke up one morning and realized that for the first time since my early 30s, I had no one to take care of but myself. It was terrifying and exhilarating. I started with the little things. I bought the expensive coffee I'd always told myself was a waste. I booked a solo weekend trip to a coastal town I'd wanted to visit for years, a place Daniel had always dismissed as too expensive or not practical. I redecorated the house, painting over the sterile grays and blues he preferred with warm, earthy tones that made me feel at home. And with each small decision, I felt a part of myself returning, a version of me I hadn't realized had been missing all these years. But it wasn't all peace and empowerment. Healing rarely is. There were nights when the loneliness crept in like a cold draft under a locked door. Nights when I lay awake wondering if I had wasted too much of my life, if I'd ever trust someone again, if the scars he left behind would always ache. I cried more than I wanted to, but even the tears were different now. Not the helpless sobs of a betrayed wife, but the bittersweet release of a woman rebuilding from the ashes. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I made a decision that changed everything. I would no longer define myself by what had been done to me. I wasn't the woman whose husband cheated. I wasn't the victim of financial betrayal. I was a survivor, a strategist, a woman who had taken back control of her life. And I intended to live it fully. I enrolled in a financial planning course, partly out of necessity and partly out of pride. Understanding money, how to protect it, how to grow it, had always been Daniel's territory. Now it was mine. I built a small investment portfolio. I started consulting part-time for a local nonprofit, something I'd always dreamed of doing but never had time for. I even launched a blog, anonymously at first, sharing my story and helping other women recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. The messages I received were overwhelming. Stories so similar to mine, it was as if we'd all lived the same betrayal, just with different names and faces. Somewhere in the midst of all this, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady and grounding, a deep understanding that my worth had never depended on Daniel's love, approval, or promises. It had always been mine. He had tried to take it from me, but in the end, I had reclaimed it. And then one afternoon, I ran into him. It was at a cafe downtown, one I'd started frequenting after the divorce. He looked smaller somehow, like a man who had lost more than just money. His clothes were rumpled, his hair graying at the temples, his eyes hollow. When he saw me, he hesitated before approaching. "You look good," he said awkwardly. "I am good," I replied, and I meant it. We spoke for a few minutes, polite but distant. He told me he was trying to rebuild, that things had been hard. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I think he knew better, but there was regret in his voice. Once, that regret might have given me satisfaction. Now, it barely registered. I wasn't here for revenge anymore. I had already won. As I walked away from that cafe, I felt lighter than I had in decades. He was a chapter, an ugly, painful, necessary chapter, but he was no longer the story. My story was just beginning. And in that story, I was no longer someone's wife, someone's victim, someone's afterthought. I was the author, the protagonist, and the hero. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't scare me. It excited me. Chapter 8, The Woman I Became. I used to think revenge was about watching the other person suffer, that the satisfaction came from seeing the pain reflected in their eyes, from knowing they felt even a fraction of the hurt they caused you. But I was wrong. True revenge, the kind that heals instead of hollowing you out, isn't about them at all. It's about you. It's about reclaiming the pieces of yourself that you gave away and learning to live without needing their apology. And that's exactly what I did. Months passed, then a year, and slowly, my life began to take shape in ways I could never have imagined while I was still tethered to Daniel's lies. The home that once felt like a mausoleum of broken promises became a sanctuary. I filled it with laughter, my laughter, and music and dinners with friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. The silence that used to feel suffocating now felt peaceful. I stopped flinching when the phone rang. I stopped checking emails obsessively. I stopped waiting for the next lie. But healing isn't linear. There were days when the anger returned uninvited, small, sharp reminders of how much he had taken from me. My youth, my trust, my belief that love was enough. And every time those thoughts surfaced, I reminded myself of the woman I had become because of that betrayal. I was sharper now, stronger, wiser. I had learned to see red flags I once ignored, to trust my intuition, to build walls where they were needed and bridges where they mattered. I no longer saw myself as a victim of Daniel's choices. I saw myself as the architect of my own rebirth. One of the most unexpected changes was how my story began to ripple outward. The blog I started, the one I thought maybe a handful of women would read, exploded. Messages poured in daily. Some were heartbreaking, from women trapped in relationships built on manipulation and lies. Others were triumphant, stories of survival and reinvention. A few even said that my story gave them the courage to leave. I responded to every message I could, and with each one, I felt a deeper sense of purpose. My pain had found meaning. It was through that community that I met Evelyn, a lawyer specializing in financial abuse cases. She invited me to speak at a conference about economic violence, a term I hadn't even known existed before. At first, I hesitated. Speak publicly about what happened. But something inside me said, yes. And when I stepped onto that stage months later, telling my story to a room full of strangers, I felt a surge of power I'd never felt before. I wasn't ashamed anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was educating, warning, empowering. The woman who once stayed silent to keep the peace was now using her voice to shake the walls. It was also around that time that I began thinking about love again. Not in the naive, all-consuming way I once had, but as something gentle, steady, and deeply earned. I went on a few dates. Most didn't go anywhere, and that was okay, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for someone to complete me. I was already whole. I wasn't searching for a savior. I was searching for a partner, and I knew I would rather be alone than ever again settle for less than I deserved. One evening, after a particularly long day, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the fireplace, reading old journal entries from the days after I discovered Daniel's betrayal. I barely recognized the woman in those pages, frightened, unsure, drowning in self-doubt. She questioned her worth, her choices, even her reality. And yet, she kept going. Step by painful step, she clawed her way out of the darkness and into the light. I closed the journal and whispered a quiet thank you to her, to the version of me who refused to give up even when everything seemed lost. She didn't know it then, but she was planting the seeds of the woman I had become. Then, something unexpected happened. Daniel reached out. It had been nearly 2 years since the divorce, and I hadn't heard from him once. His email was short, almost pitiful. He wrote that he was sorry, that he had lost almost everything, his company, his reputation, his relationship, that he was working a regular job for the first time in decades. He said he thought about me every day and hoped, if nothing else, I had found peace. I stared at the screen for a long time. Once, those words would have cracked me open. Once, I might have answered. But I didn't owe him my forgiveness. I didn't owe him closure. I didn't owe him anything. So I closed the laptop and went for a walk, the cool evening air wrapping around me like a promise. As I walked, I thought about everything I'd endured, the betrayal, the lies, the pain. And I realized that none of it defined me anymore. My story wasn't about a cheating husband or stolen money. It was about strength. It was about transformation. It was about the woman I became when I refused to be broken. I still don't know if Daniel ever truly understood what he lost. Maybe he still believes he can fix the pieces. Maybe he's still waiting for the woman he betrayed to give him one more chance. But that woman doesn't exist anymore. She was replaced by someone who knows her worth, someone who doesn't beg to be chosen because she chooses herself every single day. That night, I stood at the window and looked out over the same city where I once felt invisible. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt proud. Proud of the scars that had become my armor. Proud of the woman I'd built from the wreckage. Proud of the life that was entirely, irrevocably mine. If I could go back and speak to the woman I was when this all began, I'd tell her one thing. You will survive this. And not just survive, you will thrive. You will build a life so beautiful, so powerful, that it will make every lie, every betrayal, every sleepless night worth it. Because revenge isn't about watching them fall. It's about rising higher than they ever believed you could. And I did. I rose. And I'm never coming down. Epilogue, choosing myself. There's a moment after the storm has passed when the world feels both unfamiliar and brand new. The pieces of your old life lie scattered around you, some too sharp to touch, others too heavy to carry, and you realize that you get to choose what you rebuild. That's the place I found myself in, standing on the other side of betrayal, staring at a life I never planned, but one I was finally free to design. I won't lie and say that the scars disappeared. They didn't. They never do. But over time, I stopped seeing them as ugly reminders of what I had lost and started viewing them as proof of what I had survived. Every sleepless night, every tear, every moment I doubted myself, they weren't signs of weakness. They were evidence of resilience. I had endured the unimaginable and come out stronger than I ever believed I could be. And that strength became the foundation of everything I built afterward. Life after Daniel wasn't just about healing. It was about rediscovering myself. I learned to trust my instincts again, to celebrate my accomplishments, to protect my peace fiercely. I learned that love doesn't mean losing yourself to someone else's needs, and that loyalty isn't an excuse for self-betrayal. Most importantly, I learned that my worth was never dependent on someone's ability to see it. It had always been there, quiet, steady, waiting for me to claim it. There were moments when people asked if I regretted what I did, if the revenge, the exposure, the legal battles were worth it. And the truth is, they were, but not for the reasons most people think. It wasn't about punishing Daniel, not really. It was about holding him accountable. It was about drawing a line and saying, this is what happens when you exploit love and mistake kindness for weakness. But more than that, it was about sending a message to myself. I will never again shrink to make someone else feel bigger. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about the woman I was before all of this, hopeful, trusting, eager to build a future with someone who promised the world. I don't hate her. She did the best she could with what she knew. But I also know that she deserved more than broken promises and empty words. And now she has it. I still believe in love. I still believe in partnership. But I also believe that love should never cost you your dignity, your dreams, or your identity. If it does, it's not love, it's control wearing a pretty disguise. And once you learn to tell the difference, you'll never fall for the illusion again. So this is the ending, not of my story, but of a chapter that once defined me. Betrayal will always be part of my past, but it no longer dictates my present. I don't live in the shadow of what he did. I live in the light of what I chose to do next. And every morning, when I wake up and choose myself again and again, I know that is the truest, most powerful revenge of all. I thought he had stolen my future, but in reality, he gave me something far more valuable, a chance to create one that belongs entirely to me. And that is a gift I will never stop cherishing.